Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bounds. Today's show is a tale of two halves. We'll begin at the world's largest performance arts festival, that's the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. There, friend of the programme, Natasha Tripney, has seen a mammoth 55 shows at time of recording and counting. We'll hear her top picks if you're heading to the final week of performances, or if you're hoping to catch one of the shows in their post-Fringe life out in the wild in the rest of the world. Then we'll round out our week of cultural offerings at an exhibition at Sotheby's, which brings more than a taste of the Middle East to New Bond Street here in London. Do stay tuned. That's all coming up on Monocle on Culture. Now, first up, the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is very impressively knocking on the door of being 80 years old. During that time, it's become the not-to-miss theatre, comedy and cabaret event of the year, defined by its dizzying array of performances, from large theatres to pub backrooms and holes in the wall. It takes a lot of stamina and sanity to get a good read on the festival as a whole. Well, we found a tiny window, no pun intended, between a shed load of show watching with Monocle on Culture friend and international editor at the stage, Natasha Tripney. And lo and behold, here she is. Natasha, it's wonderful to have you back on the programme to explore some of the best or some of your greatest hits of the Edinburgh Theatrical Fringe this year. First things first, is there an overarching theme or atmosphere to this year's Edinburgh, or is there simply too much going on for you to be able to sort of stick a pin in it?
I think every year there is kind of a theme that emerges. I mean, obviously it's a huge festival. There's, I think, something like 3,900 shows this year all together. But one theme that has stood out this year is that, and we will talk about later, is that there is a lot of shows here that are dealing with grief in different ways, whether it's on a personal capacity and more general sense. And there's a lot of quite personal shows sort of dealing with trauma as well. But I think it does feel a little bit like this is, the Fringe, where people are dealing with their experiences of loss. And I don't know if that's because of the sort of the pandemic filtered into the work, or it just happens that every year there does seem to be sort of something in the water that where one theme does emerge.
Yeah, well, maybe we can actually discuss that at the end, actually, after we've discussed some of your choices as to perhaps why that might be the case, whether it's the sort of pervading atmosphere in the country and in the world, or whether there's perhaps funding ideas about this as well. But I wanted to ask you about your first choice. We're going to cover 3 plays, 3 shows in this section of the show. Exactly on point and on topic is your first choice. It's entitled My Mother's Funeral, the Show. So fill us in on this one, Natasha, please.
So this is a really interesting play. It's at Payne's Plough, which is a new writing company, and they have a space that they bring up, it's a travelling space. It's called the Roundabout. So it's a tent, an in the round tent that travels around the country, and they bring it up to Edinburgh every year. So this is one of the shows that's being performed in that space. It's a play by Kelly Jones, and the title kind of explains what it's about. It's about a young playwright whose mother passes away and she cannot afford the funeral costs, or she's worried that she won't be able to cover those costs. So the best way she thinks that she can fund this and cover those costs is to write about her experience and to write about her loss. As a working class artist, she feels under pressure anyway to write about things that are traumatic and grim. And I think there's a critique of the theatre industry is embedded in this play in a really interesting way. And so she decides to write about her own trauma, her own recent loss, in an effort to use the fee that she will receive for that to cover the costs of her mother's funeral. It sounds quite grim the way that I'm describing it, but actually it's a very funny, very heartfelt play. The sort of first half, I think, is more comedy than anything else. But by the end of the play, it does reach a really kind of poignant and emotional place. Finally, once she stopped worrying about the money issue, she's able to start grieving properly. And the protagonist of the play, and that's one of the things that it does incredibly well, is that segue from talking about the sort of financial aspect of the industry, the pressure that working class artists often find themselves under, to something really sort of heartfelt and moving about what it is to lose a parent.
I mean, this sounds fascinating, and if it's successful as you said, it sounds like a wonderful watch, Natasha. The idea that Kelly Jones has to sort of lean into her poverty, perhaps, or her working class reality in order for perhaps the average middle class theatre going audience to understand her predicament? That, well, of course, this would happen to someone like you. Is that the case? And also, perhaps, if it is, what's the makeup of the audiences that have been watching this play, I wonder?
Oh, that's an interesting question. This is Kelly. This is not an autobiographical piece. This is Kelly Jones sort of writing, but I think there's her experience of working class writing in the theatre industry, which is a very underrepresented group, and the sort of pressure that sometimes can be placed on you to tell certain stories in certain ways. Very much does feel like it's coming from a place of experience. The makeup of the audience at the Edinburgh Fringe is sort of, I don't have accurate statistics, but I would say that there is a sense that the people who are watching it are probably more like middle class theatre goers, but it's hard to quantify that exactly. Certainly there's some very pointed digs at like people who work in the industry. I think it's an interesting one for people who work in theatre to watch, because it is quite scathing about some of the attitudes that working class artists experience when they're trying to write work, especially if they want to write work that's sort of richly imaginative, or not just specifically talking about what it's like to be from a working class background. And there's jokes in the show about being asked to make it sort of grimmer and darker, and can we not make this character an alcoholic? So it's very funny in the way that it goes about this.
And it sounds like it's got a kind of Kafkaesque sort of bureaucratic theme to it, in a way that she can't get the play commissioned unless she makes it grim and about her life. But the reality is that this character can't obviously afford first and foremost to bury her mother. So she's in some catch-22, I suppose, within this play, right?
Completely. I mean, that's exactly the sort of mechanics of this piece of writing, is this sense that she's having to make this story that she's writing darker and sort of more unpleasant in order so that she can get the commissioning fee so that she can bury her mother. And like this kind of like sense of circularity is something that they really lean into, both in the writing and in Charlotte Bennett's direction, to really sort of bring out that theme of being sort of trapped in this kind of sort of grim cycle. And also the way that you can't start beginning the grieving process properly because you're still worried about the financial considerations, worrying about the funeral costs. So you can't actually start to think about the person who you've lost and start to process what that means.
And just finally on this one, Natasha, My Mother's Funeral, does this sort of hit all its marks as a kind of darkly comic sort of inspection of this sort of process? It sounds like a wonderful idea. Does it do the drama?
I think so. I think it does. It starts off. It's pretty like the comedy is quite broad to begin with. It's much more about the sort of ridiculous situation that she finds herself in, but like it does pivot sort of across the sort of course of the play to be a genuine sort of piece, like exploring the loss of a parent and the complexity of that, especially if your relationship with your parent was maybe a bit complicated, and how you begin to grieve that person. So it works on both of those levels, which is why it's, I think, one of the strongest pieces that I've seen, because it could have just been like a fun, sort of clever, like investigation of like what it is to be a working class artist in the theatre industry, but actually it is also like a really sort of poignant play about loss at the same time.
Well, thanks, Natasha. And we're going to move on to your second choice. And it's got another fighting title. This is called Shit Theatre, or What's Left of Us. And this is a production from quite a well-known fringe duo, I understand. Can you fill us in on that duo and what their reputation is?
Yeah, so this is by a company called Shit Theatre, and who are Rebecca Biscuit and Louise Mothersole. They have been coming to the Fringe for a number of years. Their work is sort of clown-like. They often have white painted faces, but they sort of blend quite silly sort of performance style. Like this stuff is very funny. It's very sort of joke laden, but also they always have a real sort of strong political undercurrent to their work. So they made one show called Letters to Windsor House, which was about precarity as a renter in London, like there's some difficulty of having any kind of sense of stability when you're living in rented accommodation, and that could be, you could be obliged to move at sort of the whim of the landlord. And more recently, they did something called Shit Theatre Drink Rum with Expats, which was about Malta and Brexit and political corruption within the EU, and very explicitly about the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. And somehow they managed to weave all these sort of disparate themes together with lots of silly jokes and songs, and create some of the most socially engaged, politically engaged work that you see up here. Like it's quite incredible balancing act, but they always manage to pull it off. They're sort of consummate, like they really, their work has a kind of chaotic energy to it, but it's always incredibly well crafted. So it's a kind of magic trick that they pull to make something that looks kind of a little bit slapdash on the surface, but is actually like incredibly careful in the way that it's put together. Like little throwaway moments and silly jokes at the beginning come back at the end in really kind of like moving and sort of very pointed ways. Like they're really sort of incredible craftspeople as well.
And I understand this one also kind of has a sadness, a deep sadness at its core. What is that, and how does that sort of bear itself out in their kind of very physical and slightly absurdist sort of theatrical style?
This show is a really like interesting show, a really moving show, because both of the performers have suffered losses since in the last couple of years. One of them lost a parent, one of them lost a partner, and this is a show where they're kind of processing all of that in the form of a show that's about folk music predominantly. So I think it's partly as a way of finding something creative for both of them to do a project that they could invest themselves in emotionally. They became very interested in the UK folk music scene. They went to a lot of folk clubs. They learned a lot of sort of folk standards and became quite immersed in that scene. And they tried to sort of recreate some of that within the show itself. So they sing a lot of folk songs. There's an encouragement to sing along if you want to. There's like a lot of beautiful music. They're also like very good musicians, so that's always been part of their work, but here they really push that to the fore. And how so many folk songs are songs about death, you know, it's embedded in a lot of those sort of lyrics, that they're songs about seasonality, sort of the sort of changing of the seasons and renewal, but there's also like quite a lot of death in a lot of our folk music, and they do lean into that in this show in just a really moving way.
Thanks, Natasha. That was your second choice, Shit Theatre or What's Left of Us. And your final choice is Ugly Bucket's Food Bank show, Stuffed. Now, our listeners will be able to tell perhaps what's going on here, but fill in the blanks for us.
So Ugly Bucket they're a young company that they make work. They're clowns. It's another clowning show, and yes, they've made a show about food banks. And I think that if we sort of say the phrase, you know, it's a clown show about food banks, that possibly might provoke certain kinds of reaction from like the kind of epitome of like a sort of slightly sort of scrappy fringe show. But actually, this is a very really. I think I was looking for work that was like socially engaged, where people had really engaged with where we are at the moment in this country. And a lot of fringe work, just by the nature of it, tends to be a little bit like you get a lot of people talking about their own experiences, their own life, their own trauma, and there's real value in that. And that's an important sort of strand of work. But this was a show that is very much about what's happened to this country over the past 14 years of Tory government and the skyrocketing sort of use of food banks across the country, what's led to that and what that means for the people who need to use these services. And so this clowning company have like approached this topic, and they've done it in a like really like considered and intelligent way. The show is quite funny, but it's also very angry, and it's like probably one of the angriest shows that I've seen, and I appreciate that. I think it's right that there's anger about what's happened in terms of poverty levels in this country, in terms of people who do, you know, the social safety nets have disappeared, so people, you know, are forced to rely on charity, they're forced to rely on food banks, and that's all sort of embedded into this show, which is like it's very loud, it's very noisy. They're dressed as workmen, and there's kind of very percussive sort of musical energy to this show. But there's also they use a lot of recorded testimonies. They interviewed a lot of people who work at food banks about what that job actually, what that sort of, it's not a job, most of them volunteers, but what that entails, who uses the service, what desperate situations they're often in. And they weave that into a show which is at times funny, but often actually quite bleak.
Yeah, and I understand that the sort of first question, well, this is certainly what came up in a review that I read from someone that works there, when they are asking the people that pass through the food bank, they say their first question is, why are you in this situation? And those testimonies from those real life testimonies are either acted out or certainly read out in this play as well. Just going back to the audience again, and I'm not asking you to give a sort of demographic makeup of the people sitting around you in the auditoriums, Natasha, but what has been the reaction to all three of these plays in the auditoria? I wonder whether the storytelling matches the anger with these plays. I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds like it does, but I just wondered what the reaction from the audience has been.
It's interesting with the Ugly Bucket show. They as part of the show itself, they are sort of providing campaigning material, information about groups that you can, if you want to donate or if you want to volunteer yourself. So instead of at the end, as would normally in the Fringe show, the actors would get on stage, they'd take their bows, and they'd probably say, come and see, spread the word. Word of mouth is important at Edinburgh. But instead of doing that, they very much urge people to get involved, and I think that's a really sort of interesting and important gesture. It's not just that they made this work, but they're very keen that people sort of are aware of what they can do as well. So there's a sort of campaigning aspect, and there's also that they have their own food collection point as well that they've set up. And I think the audience's reaction is largely positive. It's within the Fringe. I think it's important it can be quite a sort of insular kind of bubble when you're up here. The outside world can feel quite far away by the nature of what the Fringe is, but this show is very much sort of piercing that bubble in a way that I think is really healthy and really valuable. And I think audiences are responding to that. In terms of the Shit Theatre show, I think it's a very different experience. While it's very much coming from a place of their own personal pain, it really kind of encompasses any loss that anyone's feeling. That's the nature of the folk music. You're invited to sing together and share your experiences of loss. And one of the things that they're doing is after the show, they invite the audience who want to stay behind to go and sing with them. So there's an opportunity to sing together, which is a really beautiful sort of gesture. So you can go into the bar that's next to the theatre afterwards and share folk songs, or if you can't sing a folk song, you can bring whichever song you want to the experience. And when I was there, one woman knew all the lyrics to The Bad Touch and did perform it like a word perfect version of that, which was quite an experience, quite a thing to hear.
Beautiful. Natasha, good luck with the rest of your Edinburgh sojourn. I hope there is a little bit of light amongst the darkness as well. It sounds like there is a lot of comedy, yes. Ripe comedy amongst the grief in these choices as well. But thank you so much for your Edinburgh roundup. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Natasha Tripney there, watching everything at the Edinburgh Fringe so that you don't have to. Now, a Middle Eastern summer is the current curatorial and ultimately commercial offering at Sotheby's auction house in London. But even if your pockets aren't feeling quite deep enough to throw down some silver, it's an exhibition well worth visiting. On top of stunning jewellery and handbags, there are also over 50 artworks spanning 50 years of modern visual art in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as some beautiful, fascinating calligraphy. I caught up with the curator and specialist in the Middle East department at Sotheby's, Alexandra Roy, and I began by asking her to tell me about the genesis of the show.
Like you, we noticed that there were a lot of Middle Eastern clients in London in the summer, and have for quite a few years been trying to find a way to capture, I guess, that new audience. And I think these shows burgeoned or mushroomed, maybe it's not as chic a word to say, but every department got involved, which was fantastic. So it was quite organic. So I think, I'm not sure which was the first show which we discussed, but we collaborated and ended up collaborating. So this is 4 different departments, or actually I think 5 different departments who've ended up collaborating, and also with different partners. So as you walk in through New Bond Street, our boutique, which usually is our luxury boutique, looked after by our luxury team, was taken over by one of our clients called Abdul Rahman Al-Zayani, who has an jewelry advisory business called A to Z. I've actually known him for a very long time because he is a wonderful collector, and we sold his collection of Middle Eastern artworks last year. But his second passion is also jewelry. And so what he does, he has these amazing concepts, and if you manage to look at the boutique, you'll see that you have, it's an Orientalist theme, so he's gathered, I think, around 30 jewelers, international jewelers, and put them within a setting which really fitted the setting that we had imagined, which was Orientalist paintings, Islamic arts from the upcoming auction in October. So he's really nodding to that love, that shared passion which he has. And so as you walk through from the boutique, you kind of go through chronologically, I guess. The Islamic team was able to approach one of a client that we've known for a very long time called Bashir Mohammed, who has this incredible collection of calligraphy. And they've selected, I think he's got over he's got hundreds, I'm sure, of calligraphic pages because I know him as well. And they managed to find a selection of around 30. I mean, after all of that, whittling down to really try to show the chronology of the script, so Arabic script from over 1,000 years, so from the most amazing blue Quran leaf. So it's a double page bifolium, and it's dyed blue vellum and written completely in gold. And this is one of the most famous Qurans which is known. There are pages which are dispersed in museums around the world. And to have a bifolium when you walk in is pretty amazing. And all the way through to the contemporary calligraphers.
And on that, and we'll start downstairs then. Also downstairs there's the collection of Orientalist paintings. It's a bold way of naming a collection. I like that because it is exactly what we see on the walls. I wonder what collectors, you've obviously got the ear of collectors walking around. You're interested to hear what they say as they walk around. What is the collector base for this sort of work? Because of course it was mostly painted by Western artists about people from the Middle East and about their habits, or what we assumed were their habits. How does a show like this go down, or a section of a show like this go down? I wonder if you've been eavesdropping on the conversations in the galleries downstairs.
Well, actually, I know the collector, and they're from the Middle East, and a lot of the collectors for Orientalist painting now, which I love, there's this I was having a discussion with a client yesterday, I guess a post-Orientalist view, in the sense that some of the biggest collections of Orientalist painting there's going to be a museum which opens in Doha dedicated to Orientalist painting. There's a museum in Malaysia, the Islamic Arts Museum Malaysia, which has an amazing collection of Orientalist painting. I think that some of the other collections, the Shafi Gabr collection, it's an Egyptian collection. So I think there's something extraordinary about the fact there's this reclaiming of their heritage. And so back and forth the discourse, since Edward Said's Orientalism, and the discourse I think goes back and forth between the negative, the positive. For me, I think it sends a really positive message. And I think they're incredible paintings to look at.
I mean, they're beautiful paintings. I think it's just interesting. And you're right, the kind of ball has returned to that the other court, in terms of kind of the way that these things are appreciated culturally and historically, I suppose. And now we have, as if by magic, we're upstairs in a very commanding room upstairs here at Sotheby's. And we're in what you called the Pioneers section. Can you give us a little bit of a taste on what's on the walls around us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is our main gallery. So really, I guess as you say it so well, the best, one of the best galleries. But we're really excited because we have been speaking to a gallerist called Kaswara Hafez, who has a gallery, Hafez Gallery in Jeddah. And he has had this idea in his head for a long time to organize an exhibition trying to introduce 50 years of art making in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from 1965 to 2015. And these are quite formative years, and for multiple reasons. I think when you are looking at the pioneers, we've divided the exhibition in 3 stages. The pioneers were currently in the pioneering section. So the first artists, the ones who were working in 1965 to circa 1980, they were artists who, for the most part, traveled abroad, were taught, different techniques of painting, of looking, came back into the kingdom and decided to really develop their own artistic scene, their own style of painting, but something which is very much rooted in their tradition, in what they were seeing around them. And I think that you can really sense that when you're looking at the paintings around here. So there are different artists who are looking at, let's say, the way that their peers were dressed, or landscapes, the desert. Looking at themes of, I guess, identity is very important. But they were also teachers, and then they were teaching art, they were publishing books on artists, they were supporting each other with exhibitions. So I think there's something really rich about that, and I think the second and third generation are still very indebted to this generation. And in some cases, it's the first time that they're shown outside the kingdom, which is very exciting.
And we see there's such a broad range of styles around us. And I wonder if these have been chosen for their range of styles, or whether this is simply typical of the range of stuff that was coming out of the kingdom over the last 50 years, because there's figurative things, there are abstract things, there are things that look a little bit vorticist in the earlier room that we walked through. So yes, have you chosen this to be an absolute cross-section, I wonder?
Yeah, definitely. And really, I have to, hats off to Kaswara, who really went around the kingdom, and Saudi Arabia is a huge country, and getting in touch with the artists themselves, the families, really sourcing works that are hard to find, that are hard to see. So it really provides this amazing opportunity to see some artworks. The challenge, I think the biggest challenge, was finding works that maybe are representative of an artist throughout their whole career, because really what we're just showing is one artwork per artist. So that was where sometimes it was very difficult. You might want a particular time period, but in a case like someone like Safia bin Zagar, for example, she only ever sold 3 works, and she set up her own museum, and so you're never going to find that artwork that you want to show of hers, but maybe for good reasons. I think that's quite wonderful that she took ownership of her work. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned the name of a female artist. There's a lot of female artists in this show, and that is perhaps something that is misunderstood about people from the outside looking into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the broader region, the amount of female influence on the arts, and indeed female artists making work. That, I'm sure, wasn't one of the points of the show, but maybe it's a happy accident. I don't know what you think about it.
Well, I don't know. If you take my view, women globally are underrepresented. It's not just, and I think it's more and more we try, of course, to show more and more female artists. And my sales, the modern and contemporary Middle East sales, are half-half, really, in terms of, female and male. I think that it is important to show that there were artists like that, and, who were organizing exhibitions as well, and who were, I think, supported also by the male artists. I think all of the artists were supporting each other, and there was this real sense of community, which I think is quite extraordinary, actually, when I'm making connections. And if you look just in this room, a lot of these artists were founders of, the Riyadh art group, the Jeddah art group. So they were really founding these, I guess, groups to help each other. So I think that's quite magical.
And that is it for this week. My thanks to Natasha Tripney and to Alexandra Roy there. And a Middle Eastern summer runs until the 30th of August at Sotheby's in central London. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. A special thanks this week to Flynn Simons for their help. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bound, thank you for tuning in.